Let's take a look at configuring domain controller. So what type of information goes into the domain XML file? So the domain XML file, typically you'll have the extension, all the extension modules to be defined here. You can have system properties. You can declare the name variable, or so paths also you can declare the name variables. But on top of that, important things that typically in the domain XML files is the extensions, profiles. Pretty much all the profiles, default, HA, full HA profiles. And then the socket binding groups, default socket, standards, the default socket, HA socket, full HA sockets, binding groups. And then any application deployment, each application you deploy will actually create a tag entry under deployment section. And also we'll have each of the server groups definition. And then as you deploy application to server group, it actually establishes like a reference links for the deployment unit under the server groups also. Let's take a look at the domain XML file here. As you can notice here, domain XML file. As I'm showing one part of the machine1 folder, which is actually acting as in our lab case for the lab purposes, the machine1 domain folder that actually acting as the domain controller. So it's using the domain XML file there. So it has the extensions, system properties, for example, the definition and a path definition here. So you can actually have you can define those, just simply declare them and then define them in a host XML file, or you can just simply declare them and also associate with the value here, for example, for system properties and path. And then with the profiles here, it actually have all these profile name default, and then within that default profile, the various subsystem within that profiles. So if I want to look at, for let's say for example, the HA profile. Here's actually the HA profile here, profile name HA, and then also all the subsystem there. And then you have the socket binding groups. Let's take a look at the socket binding groups here. It's a pretty long file. So here's a socket binding groups with an S. So socket binding group name standard socket, all the default socket binding here, for example, HTTP port 8080. And then the HA socket binding group, HA socket, again, basically it uses the default HTTP port 8080, and based on HA has additional port bindings here on top of the default here, additional port bindings. And then full socket binding group, and then full HA socket binding groups, you'll find those there. So profiles and socket binding groups, and on top of that, what's unique for domain XML file is the deployment. As you deploy any application, you'll end up creating a tag entry here with the deployment name, example.wo, a runtime name, runtime attribute, and this has to be unique. The runtime attribute has to be unique across any number of application deploy, and then it also will create a SSH string here for this application itself. And here a bunch of application being deployed. And then another important part that you will find part of this domain XML file is the server groups. Basically the server groups are defined here. For example, dev group, which profile is going to use, which socket binding groups is going to use, all that defined part of the domain XML file. And then basically you have, as you deploy application targeting to a specific group, it actually will create a reference here under the deployments here. For example, deployment example.wo, runtime name example. This runtime name example, it actually will resolve to name example here, resolve to here, this one right here. So as you deploy application, you create an entry in the deployment section, and then also we'll start creating entry under the server groups, part of each server group. So you can simply looking at the file, you can tell which application being targeted to which group. So here's a production server group here, and then you will notice that these applications are deployed to production server group, like the version.wo application deployed to the production server group here. And then you see that it has an entry for the actual entry for the version.wo application. So here's basically a reference that is established as you attach and add the application to a group. So when you deploy, it'll be available, and then you can able to make the application available to any particular group. And whenever you do that, it'll actually create this tag entries here under the deployment. Now, what's the difference between the domain XML and host XML file? So part of your course material, this is an excellent slide here. It's part of the course material also. Kind of shows you a distinction between the domain XML and host XML file. So the domain XML file, the most important thing, like specific to domain XML file, things like extension. Extensions are only on domain XML file. System properties, you can declare them, you can override them in a host XML file. Whichever, if you have the same property defined on a host XML file, it will override it. So host XML file will take precedence if the same information on both domain and host XML file. And that's only for certain things like system properties, the path. You can declare the variable here, but you can define it specific to a particular host code. You can define it here. The management tag entry, that's only specific to the host XML file. You won't find a management tag in the domain XML file, because how you authenticate using CLI or the host controller communication, that's part of the management sections only on the host control XML file. As you can notice here, the host slave XML file, you'll see the management tag entries. The host XML file, like host master, will have the management tag here, but not in the domain XML. You won't find that part of the domain XML. Profiles will be specific to domain XML. Interfaces can be declared in a domain XML file, but the concrete definition will be on the host XML file. Let me show you an example on interface here. Let me search on interface in a domain XML file here. Notice here we kind of declared three interfaces here: management, public, and secure. And in a host slave XML file, it actually have a concrete definition under the interfaces, interface name management. So what's actually the address is actually going to the management base application going to bind to. That's actually it's trying to show here. And for the interface public, what's the address the public pretty much application or public interface going to bind to is actually shows here. So that's type of information you'll find in the host controller. So domain kind of declare that, but host XML files actually can define those ones. The other things like JVM settings, that's nothing specific domain unless the domain, well, typically you don't find anything in the domain XML, only that's specific to the host XML file. So the JVMs are specific to host XML files, so there's no declaration of JVMs in the domain XML file. But there's one JVM declaration will be under the server groups. We'll get to that later on. Server groups have some JVM definition, but not a kind of outside of the server group. You won't find a JVM declaration. So the host XML file kind of have the JVM tag entries. You'll find those, but you won't find a JVM tag entry there. But in a server group section, you will find JVM tag entries. Let me show you an example, like a server group here. I have an example of a JVM. So when we get to the JVM unit 10, we'll discuss that, which will override the others, because the JVM can be in 3 different places. So we'll discuss that later on in a later unit. And server's definition, that is specific to the host XML. Pretty much the host controller manages the server instance, stop and start the server process. So that'll be part of the host XML file. So host slave XML file, for example, defining the server name dev server 1 here, for example, dev server, another server here, production server A. And socket binding groups profile, that's all in domain XML file. The server groups also in the domain XML file, and deployments also in the domain XML file, which we kind of looked at just now. So server group definition, deployments definitions, a socket binding group definition, all that part of the domain XML file. So when it comes to domain mode, bottom line, pretty much most of the information in a domain XML file, something specific to the host XML file, things like the JVM definition, the actual concrete interface definition, how that's going to bind to each one of the servers, how they're going to bind to on a management of the public interfaces, and things like how whether it's going to act as a slave controller or the master controller, for example, under the domain here, domain controller local. That's actually something specific to the host controller. And also important part is the management section. The management section, which security realms for management authentication for the domain controller to communicate with each other, the domain controller, host controller, how they're going to authenticate, and when you deploy some application, how they're going to authenticate, authorize. By default, you can use this application realm for application. Now you will later on we'll talk about the security unit how to refactor those for application itself. Those are the kind of things you will find in the host XML file and the server definition, actual server that being managed by the host controller. You will see those. So to summarize these things, take a look at this diagram here. So domain controller or master host controller typically don't have any servers running, and then other slave controller will connect to the domain controller, pull the domain XML information from there. The host master XML and the host slave XML, based on how they're going to act as, will be used. So here, as you notice here, this host controllers manages the server. Server A, server B managed by this host controller 1. So the host slave XML file, part of this host controller, will define those servers here, whereas server groups information will be defined part of the domain XML file. So those are the kind of the main things that differences you find between the domain and host XML file. The server groups definition, whenever you deploy an applications, things will be part of the domain XML file. The server definition, the JVM definition, some of them will be specific to the host controller XML file, and there are exceptions. We'll get to that later on as we go through. But keep in mind, every time you start a controller, it's combining the domain and host XML file. So only the domain controller uses the domain XML, and then it uses the host master XML when it's acted as a domain controller. All the other host controller basically uses the host XML, which is the host slave XML, and then it'll pull the domain configuration from the domain controller. So that's conclude this sections here. Let's take a look at some of these lab in the next section.